And now we're shifting from the more strictly historical observations, turning now to literary observations. The next several slides, we'll follow a pattern initiated in this slide, that is, watching to see the degree to which the various elements of God's fundamental arrangement, his call with Abram, to what degree are these played out within the lifespan of Abram. And by the way, as I'm lecturing through this material, I find myself vacillating between calling him Abram and Abraham. I trust you can work with me on that. Earliest, he's Abram. Later on, his name is changed to Abraham. We'll explore that more particularly in a later slide. Here, then, we want to focus on the call of Abraham in verse 1 through 3 of chapter 12. Let's take a look at that. So we read, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" So we notice two parts here. The part where he is instructed to leave the secure surroundings that he has grown up with. And this trio, your country, your kindred, and your father's house, would have struck Abram, and we should be able to detect it at least to some degree, as a narrowing of focus. Leaving your country, that's quite expansive. Leaving your kindred, this is getting a little more costly, to leave the network of relatives. And then when called to leave even his father's house, this would be the more distinct and narrow circle of relationships, family members. So the call of God becomes more and more costly, we might say, as he's asked to cut ties with his security network. To go to a land, God says, that I will show you, a land as yet undisclosed. And this then entails some of the measure of faith required by Abram, as he doesn't even know the name of the nation where he's going. In verse 2, then, we see the incentive for Abram to follow this call, as he is invited to enjoy the prosperity of becoming a great nation and being blessed by God and having a name that is a reputation of fame. Now, I do need to differ with the translation that's offered us here at the end of verse 2, for it reads there that you will be a blessing, as if promising that, in essence, wherever Abram shows up, blessing will sort of flow out from him. Admittedly, it's a winsome picture, and it's clearly expressed at the end of verse 3, where it says, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." That clearly conveys the notion that Abram is going to be an agent, like a gateway of blessing to others. But actually, back at the end of verse 2, the Hebrew more carefully read yields the translation of a command. "I will make your name great, and you, Abraham, must be a blessing." Be about the business of being a blessing to other people. The form in Hebrew is a command form. It's an imperative, which unfortunately has been blurred in some translations, such as the one we're looking at here. Here then we see the two components, leaving and being called to bless others, with the subparts associated with them. The benefits under leaving, and then after being commanded to bless others, we see some more benefits. Blessing coming to those who bless Abram, cursing coming to those who curse him, and finally, all being blessed through Abram. Incidentally, there is a chiasm in the reversal of elements on the line reading, "Blessing result will come to those who bless you. We find that component switching sequence in the next line with the reciprocation. And we observe that in the use of the word all will be blessed. This operates as a sort of summation. It's very universal and grand in scope. The succeeding slides will take up the same pattern, and you see the same wording in the left column, leave and bless others, with the various subpoints. And then rather swiftly, we'll watch to see how in remaining chapters, the degree to which this was actualized in and through Abram and his family. We'll pass through this rather rapidly, and it'll serve as a bit of review of these chapters. So continuing then in the balance of chapter 12, we see that as to the command to leave, yes, in fact, Abraham did leave. He's out of Ur of the Chaldees by this point. Does he become a great nation? Well, actually, this is problematic, and hence the red as a cautionary typeface type color. This is problematic because Sarai, his wife, is taken into Pharaoh's harem, and there is the risk of an offspring born to Sarai that is not fathered by Abram. Does he bless others? Well, if you were to ask Pharaoh at the outcome of this episode, Pharaoh would say, "You were not a blessing to me. You were a pain in my side." Do those who disparage or risk harming Abram, are they somehow interfered with by God? That is, cursed in a measure of speaking. Yes, there was risk potential from Pharaoh, and Abram was protected in that setting. So we might see that coming true. We'll pause just briefly from before we move on to the next chapter to point out the family structure of Abram and Sarah, their parentage and successors, in order to show how it was in this Egypt episode that Abram actually was truthful when he identified Sarah not as his wife, but as his sister. If you take it from the upper right, you'll see that there's this father individual, Terah, who had two wives. We're not given the names here, but wife A and wife B. Wife A gave birth with Terah to Abraham. Terah plus wife B gave birth to Sarah. So in fact, Abram and Sarah shared the same father, Terah. This does not excuse Abram for having identified Sarah as his sister and not as his wife, but it does give us the background for him making that statement. And now chapter 13. This is the situation when Lot's group, his nephew, Abram's nephew, becomes so numerous that there's tension between him and his holdings, his shepherds, and Abram's. We notice that prosperity is very evident. They have become so numerous that tension has resulted. Does Abraham act to bless others? We might say that his generosity in giving Lot the first choice of the territories was an act of generosity. This is the case where Lot chooses the plains down in the Sodom or Gomorrah territory. Chapter 14, this is the episode when kings form a coalition against the Sodom and Gomorrah territory. Lot is captured along with others. And let's walk through our pattern. Do we see that Abram's been blessed? The fact that he gives some money to Melchizedek suggests that he is in a place of prosperity. Does he gain a great name? Sodom's king certainly thinks Abraham is very wonderful because he was the agent of rescuing the prisoners of war. So he's honored in that fashion. And that action of delivering the captive cities certainly is a case of Abraham blessing others. And we see that opponents are defeated, which would fit with God protecting Abraham against or from those persons who are his opponents. Now, chapter 15, this is where Abram doubts God's readiness or ability to actually follow through on the promise to provide an heir. And he asks, should I take my chief servant, Eliezer, and make him an heir? So we see this whole issue of becoming a great nation rising to the fore and becoming really the main topic in this chapter as Abraham questions whether or not this is really going to come true. Beautifully, we find God responding to Abram. He doesn't say, well, of course I'm going to. Why are you doubting? And perhaps give Abram a list of reasons why he's disappointed with Abram. Instead, God responds with reassurance. And here we've already looked at the self-maledictory oath, the animals that were divided in half and the pot of fire moving between them. A rich and personal reassurance of Abram, telling us God's character at this point. Chapter 16 is the point in their inability to conceive a child where Sarai recommends that Abram follow the practice of having sexual relations with Hagar to see if perhaps they can have a son through her as a member of the household. So that once again, the issue of becoming a great nation is called into question, and Sarah and Abram look for an alternative to customary childbirth between them, since that avenue has not worked for them yet. And then, as we've mentioned before, this Plan B that they institute severely complicates the whole family structure by this recourse. Chapter 17 is a case where God's promise concerning a great nation coming from Abram and Sarah is reconfirmed. It is significant here that the visitors that come to Abram in this marvelous encounter make it very plain that Sarah will be the mother. This is on the heels of them attempting to provide an heir through someone other than Abraham's full wife, Sarah, but instead through Hagar. Also at this time, there is a change of names. And let's briefly look at this. Avram, the pronunciation of Abram, his first name is a combination of father and exalted. And we understand that the shift to Abraham is father of a multitude. So through the name confirming again what God had earlier promised, that there would be a great nation. It hasn't happened yet, but God is calling Abraham father of a multitude already before it has happened. Sarai means my princess, and when we move to Sarah, as far as we know, the only shift here is moving from an archaic form to a modern form. So confirming that her honored name of honor given to her by her parents, God is saying, yes, that sticks. Perhaps this was a reassurance because of the complication and pain that developed through their recourse to Hagar. Maybe God is saying, you are still a princess in my eyes, even though the pathway that you and Abraham took some months ago was really hurtful and problematic and not what I intended. A moment ago, I misspoke when I said that the Genesis 17 was the visit by the three individuals. Please correct that. That didn't happen until Genesis 18. Genesis 17 was a separate visit, simply an encounter with God, if you can at all call an encounter with God something simple. But at least that's the accurate presentation of it. So these three visitors come, and Abram and Sarah extend hospitality to them in Genesis 18. There's reconfirmation concerning Sarah, so this theme of great nation continues, although no child has been born to them yet. As to Abram behaving in a way that blesses others, we might observe that the simple act of Middle Eastern hospitality extended to these three strangers was a form of blessing others. And I'm sure by the time the meeting was done, he was certainly glad that he had done so. Do not we recall that a New Testament writer reflects on this episode when he says, "Some entertained angels unaware." And so it proves to be an example to us to practice hospitality. Genesis 18 also includes the place where, at the conclusion of conversation with Abraham and Sarah, the visitors, which we understand to be God to be involved very much there, asks rhetorically, "Should I not let Abraham in on what I'm about to do with Sodom and Gomorrah, with the judgment that will be visited on them?" This information is disclosed to Abraham, and he responds by interceding for Sodom, aware that his nephew Lot and family live there. It seems to me this would be an instance of Abraham already beginning to bless other nations, them receiving blessing through him. In chapter 19, then, we're enabled to follow God's messengers as they bring destruction to Sodom, first rescuing Lot. Thus, although the whole city is not saved, at least Lot is rescued. You may wish to take a brief look at Genesis 18:19, which is couched right at the early edge of the Sodom and Gomorrah anticipating the destruction that's going to come to them. And here we see God's assessment of the important contribution Abraham is making by raising his family in such a way that they will honor God and be an agent of God's blessing to all other nations, in distinct contrast to the way that the city of Sodom is conducting itself in such a fashion that it earns God's judgment. Abraham is leading a different sort of family, strategic within his culture and God's global and grand scheme to reclaim creation. He's doing that with families today, too, that are living different than the culture around them, although admittedly Abraham's was unique in the grand scheme, as setting up the family that would lead to the nation of Israel that would bring the Messiah to this cosmos. When we come into chapter 20 of Genesis, we find Abraham and Sarah and their household living for a time in the territory of Gerar. Here again, Abraham identifies Sarah as his sister, not his wife. The king of Gerar responds by taking Sarah into his household. So the notion of, and the promise, the anticipation of becoming a great nation is really muddled once again through the behavior of Abraham. There is risk that Sarah will have a child, but it won't be Abraham's. And that really confuses, to put it mildly, the promise of a nation through Abraham and Sarah. Does prosperity issue to Abraham? Well, in fact, when Abimelech tells him to leave, not on happy terms, he does receive what I guess you might consider reparation for Abimelech, that is the Gerar king's unwitting trespass of taking Abraham's wife Sarah to be in his own household. Isn't it ironic that in these situations with Pharaoh and Abimelech, we find them responding to carrying out a higher code of conduct than the main hero figure, God's figure? Doesn't mean these kings were perfect, but it's quite an indictment, isn't it, on God's hero when the Gentile nations, as we might consider them, the people outside of God's new, fresh plan, are conducting themselves according to a higher code. Now, admittedly, sometimes that comes as a dream tells these monarchs shape up or ship out. So there's motivation for them to cooperate with God's ethics. Does Abraham bless others? I don't think Abimelech would have said so. On another hand, we do find Abraham praying for Abimelech, and so that intercession is a grace to him. And Abram and his family They were protected, so that would be a case of the next to the last bullet being enacted. Finally, in chapter 1, we have the account of a child being born to Abram and Sarah, Isaac. King Abimelech thinks so highly of Abraham that he makes an overture for a treaty with him. There is great pain of heart when, despite Abraham's love for his son Ishmael, he finds he must turn Ishmael with his mother Hagar out, dismiss them. It does make them free, emancipate, but it is a painful freedom. And if pain of that sort were not hard enough, then we come to chapter 22, when God identifies Isaac, your son whom you love, that threefold identification, redundancy that zeroes in on the heart of Abraham and his love for this at last born son after such a long wait, and asks Abraham to do the hardest thing, to give him up in sacrifice. This instruction of God will remain mysterious to us. That is to say, how on earth could a God who is a God of power and love ask such a terrible thing? But we want to live with this passage long enough to see what God is doing and to see that the majesty of God's resolution of it. The direction that God guides Abraham together with Isaac and some servants to travel is to a place called Mount Moriah. The orientation on this map, you could see the Mediterranean Sea on the far lower left. If we were to travel down the corner of the far lower right, then we'd make our way to the Red Sea and then across to Egypt. At the upper left, we see Mount Moriah, and this winds up being, later on, the territory of Jerusalem. As we study the name Moriah and look at the components of it, it's possible that it's comprised of these elements. Morah has the idea of being bitter of spirit, and if we were to combine that with the divine name Yah or Yahweh, this might be the result then, the name Moriah, with the meaning bitterness or grief of Yahweh, or potentially Yahweh is my bitterness. This is a possible meaning of it, which, given the pain that Abraham experienced through this process of the costly call of God to give up his son, I can imagine him saying, that location name sure fits what I'm going through, because grief is what it's costing me. Bitterness is what it's costing me to follow Yahweh, the Lord. So here the promise of a great nation is just completely threatened. And what worth is the wealth that Abraham has accumulated if there is no son, no offspring to pass it along to? Consequently, the notion of a great name would be threatened, for Abraham's fame would die with him. As Abraham emerges successful from this test, we find God reiterating to him the promise of blessing to all nations. Let's take a brief look at that. Notice here in Genesis 22, verse 17, I indeed will bless you. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, the sand on the seashore. Your offspring shall possess the gates of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. A very, very rich affirmation of the initial promise that God has said, by this test and your passing of it, you have confirmed what I hoped would be the case, that through you immense blessing would indeed be issued. You have qualified yourself for this very, very high role. As we come to chapter 23 and ask the question of fulfillment of these various elements of God's promise and call, Sarah dies and Abraham arranges to purchase a plot of ground where she can be buried, a cave. And we're left with a realization that as far as God's promise to give this land to Abraham and Sarah and his offspring, the only extent of real estate to which Abraham holds title is a small plot, a grave. Is the writer perhaps saying to us through this that the paucity, the poverty, the smallness of fulfillment of that grand promise still at times may have impressed Abraham as being a dead promise? And yet, on the bright side, Abraham has something of a toehold in the land. He has a little place that he can call his, and this then later on, much later on, will expand as Israel moves in to Canaan after the Exodus. Chapter 24 is a beautiful chapter, isn't it? As we find Abraham's servant traveling back to Abraham's homeland in order to secure a bride for Isaac. The importance of this for the great nation component is unmistakable. There will be no great nation even given a son, Isaac, if Isaac does not have a wife and they do not have children. I use the expression here, a kosher bride, just to encapsulate the concept that Abraham wants to be sure that the bride for his son is one who will be in keeping with the belief system and the values that he is trying to raise his son to embrace. He wants, we might say, a godly bride for him. In his instruction to his servant that Isaac must himself not go back to the homeland, to Ur the Chaldees, it's as though Abraham is saying, if Isaac himself were to go back there, he might never return to this promised land. And we've got to make sure we don't forget our calling, give up on it, and be enticed to go back where it was comfortable and there's family structure still in place back there. A few more observations we might make from chapter 24 follow along these lines. As noted a moment ago, the family line would stop if there is no bride for this miracle son Isaac. So this is the backdrop of problem, the crisis which this chapter seeks to solve. And we've noted that Isaac must not be taken out of Canaan, but also one of the stipulations of Abram to his servant is that he must not take a wife from Canaan for Isaac. And that confirms our earlier observation that the wife for Isaac must be one who already embraces the values and the awareness of the God of Abraham. The chapter concludes in real joy, isn't it, as Rebekah agrees to accompany the servant to be married through this arranged marriage to Isaac. And so we see that the God of Abraham answers specific prayer for Abraham's servant, for he issues that beautiful prayer as soon as he arrives in the territory of Laban's family. This prayer in the interest for someone else, for his employer's son, Isaac. Beautiful picture of a faithful servant.